Supply chain issues, inflation, and a possible global recession are looming all over the world as the Eastern European countries of Russia and Ukraine continue to rage on. Russia was thought to run over Ukraine and have a convincing win in a few months' time. But the world is beginning to see the strength of Ukraine and the NATO countries, who have essentially funded the war for the Ukrainian nation to defend their home country. And finally, on September 6, 2022, Ukraine launched its long-awaited counterattack that aims to retake some of the territories that Russia previously conquered earlier on. This said counterattack has made headlines for being successful. In fact, Ukraine was able to reclaim about 7% of its lost lands. Aside from their successful counteroffensive, the reason for its success is something much more interesting. In this video, we will talk about why Ukraine was successful and how Russia itself played a part in the partial victory of its opponent. It is said that basically, Russia handcuffed itself, and Ukraine simply exploited this self-imposed handicap to the fullest extent possible. If you enjoy content like this, go ahead and like and subscribe to this video, as I appreciate all of your support. Now, let's get started. A detailed narrative. Ukraine is said to have taken advantage of the tactical mistake of Russia. But what caused this handicap to happen in the first place? Let us get into the details of how Russia handcuffed itself and how Ukraine was able to make the best of this situation. Target prospects. Ukraine's counterattack against one of the global superpowers was successful not because they're simply more powerful, but ironically, it is because their opponent helped them unknowingly. To provide some background, there are two prospective targets for attack that, if won, will greatly shift the tide in Ukraine's favor: Kherson and Kharkiv. Kherson is a southern province which was a desirable Ukrainian pickup and was a clear military weakness for Russia. The province was captured early on in the war to serve as a foothead to head towards Odessa and further prevent Ukraine's access to the Black Sea. Kharkiv, on the other hand, is a large city situated up north, which was a main target in the early stages of the conflict. Russia has been using some surrounding Ukrainian cities as distribution hubs. While Russia does not have full control over the area, Ukraine countering in this location could result in the liberation of citizens within the cities, which in turn can force Moscow to reconsider its approach to the war. The first touch move. Now we will move on to one of Russia's first touch moves that they did not expect. When Russia's special military operation, as they call it, began, they already were facing a shortage in manpower. In estimation, there were about 200,000 combined Russia-loyal forces. While this number seems huge at first, it actually puts them at a disadvantage, especially when we are talking about a country as big as Ukraine. It seems that Putin was looking forward to Ukraine's abandoning their government at the first signs of distress and would welcome Russian forces. Putin was even hoping that at least they would be indifferent about it, which turned out not to be the case. This wrong-way bet backfired on Russian forces, which forced them to retreat from the Kiev front after the first month of the war. The need of Russia to mobilize additional citizens to be drafted to enter their forces has seemed to backfire, as it shows weakness. But more importantly, many Russian men have left the city in the thousands in fear of getting mobilized by the Russian armed forces. The second mistake. It appears that Putin had made another major miscalculation. NATO has struggled with infighting within the members of its organization for a few years. One of Russia's decisions to invade Ukraine was their assumption of a weakened NATO ally. Essentially, Russia concluded that the said alliance would soon splinter as a response to their invasion. But he probably did not see it coming that it was this same invasion that will provide NATO a renewed purpose. To further worsen the condition for Russia, the conflict also united countries that were traditionally part of the Western Bloc. Aside from this, Ukraine's early triumphs showed these Western countries that their fight was worth backing. As a result, Western weapons came flooding into Ukraine's aid months after the war began. Ukraine received artillery systems, most notably the HIMARS launchers, soon leveled Russia's advantage in weaponry. And now, Russia's early advantages are slowly evaporating into thin air. Breaking bridges. On Ukraine's end, they had fully exploited Russia's disadvantage of being on the eastern side of the line of control. Russia retreated in those areas and strategically destroyed key infrastructures that greatly reduced Russia's mobility. With this, the situation is about to get worse for Russia in the area of Kherson. There are 3 key bridges that connect land over the Dnipro River, and we already know that Ukraine has no problem breaking their own bridges. It appears now that Ukraine has spent the last few months HIMARSing these said bridges, and while the bridges are still standing, military vehicles can no longer pass through them, which greatly slowed down Moscow's forces. They tried to address the problem by creating makeshift pontoon bridges, but Ukraine has been getting intel about these too, and apparently are striking those as well. Cat fell into the mouse's trap. We cannot deny the power imbalance between these two opposing forces. Russia is a global superpower after all. But what happened next is that the cat fell into the mouse's trap. Ukraine has forced Russia to make the first move by blasting some bridges, and it resulted in them being able to predict the latter's next moves. By closely monitoring Russia's anticipated movements, Ukraine does not have to play the guessing game because, well, they have intel. It was a strategic move for them to force Russia to make a choice and counter accordingly, depending on what the superpower opts to do. What happened is that Russia chose to keep its forces in Kherson, which we assume to be the more valuable choice between the two. This resulted in Ukraine being able to conquer the north, which pushed Russia back into a haste retreat. The considerations. While Russia has been triumphant in the early stages of pushing back, there are still multiple areas for consideration. First, one on the list is that Russia's problem is being unable to cover much land with their limited manpower. So, those being forced to retreat are now concentrating these forces. Now that they do not have much area to guard, their military force is now more concentrated than ever. Another one is the inevitable march of time and changing of seasons. Previously, nature was seemingly on Ukraine's side, as the muddy terrain called Rasputitsa had been hindering Russian vehicles. It hampered Russia's initial invasion as the mud made it difficult for vehicles to pass through, especially tanks. Rasputitsa provides the defenders a great advantage, and maybe this is why Ukraine decided to push forward its counteroffensive in September. Waiting another month might result in unfavorable weather conditions for them. And lastly, the turning of tides. While Ukraine has been successful so far, it is common knowledge that wars can have dramatic sways in momentum like a pendulum on a clock. These few victories are not to be taken for granted, as Russia still has great chances at tipping the tide in their favor. They still have leverage on oil and are still considered the third most powerful country in the world. The deal with Putin. There are 2 probable outcomes for Putin. If he politically owns the war, he might secure an untenable leadership position. On the other hand, the political instability might result in his fall. The first one happens in a way that if Ukraine dominates the war, it then pushes forward an incentive to end this so-called special military operation and push forward a true war. However, this scenario comes with many challenges, especially now that Russia has been facing sanctions. On the other side, the mobilization itself might deem unsustainable and might cause enough instability. With this, Ukraine's problem will most likely solve itself with the fall of Russia's leader. There is a third option. Putin can actually exit a losing war without grave political repercussions. Labeling it as a special military operation rather than a war is a political cover. Ukraine is by no means more powerful than Russia, but Russia has put itself into unfavorable conditions more than a few times already. As Putin faces an intricate maze of political considerations, Ukraine can make use of this to get the upper hand in a battle that is not only fought on the field, but politically as well.